May I proceed?
Yes.
Officer Foster, I want to talk about that speed calculation you just talked about on direct examination.
Good morning, Counselor. Okay.
You mentioned that you used a formula to make your conclusion.
Yes, I did.
In this formula, there's a variable called drag factor.
Yes, I explained the drag factor, yes.
In order to calculate drag factor, in this case, you used a drag sled, didn't you?
Yes, as I indicated, I used a drag sled, which is a simple device. It's basically a section of tire, and then we have a weight that we pull against it. From that, we're able to determine the amount of friction that's applied to that tire, and we can then tell what the drag factor would be for that surface. In this case, it was grass, and it was also a road. And then we compare it to the article to make sure.
Objection, Your Honor. Witness is being non-responsive. I simply asked him if he used a drag sled. He went on to talk about friction. He went on to talk about friction and other
So
vehicles.
what are you asking the court to do?
I'm asking the court to strike everything after yes.
It'll be stricken.
So, Officer Foster, you used a drag sled, correct?
Yes, I did.
But you're aware that using a drag sled can lead to a large error.
I'm not aware of that.
Well, you're aware that in the scientific community, there's a large debate as to the validity of using a drag sled.
Oh, I think I know what you're talking about. Sometimes errors have occurred when people don't pull the drag sled parallel to the roadway. So I made a deliberate, purposeful, straight pull, and that eliminates that error. A lot of times, if you have a novice operator of a drag sled, they'll just sort of yank it and try to jag it halfway across the street. That does produce errors. So we deliberately pull, and it's Midland Center's procedure, exactly 10 feet in a parallel motion to whatever surface we're testing.
Officer Foster, directing you back to my question. You're aware that in the scientific community, there's a large debate as to the validity of using a drag sled.
As I just explained, that was what I'm aware of.
Is that a yes?
Yes, as I just explained.
Officer Foster, on that September 24th, 2010, it was raining, wasn't it?
Yes, it's a torrential downpour at one point.
So it was a torrential downpour on September 24th, 2010.
That's absolutely correct. It was raining like cats and dogs.
But on September 24th, 2010, that wasn't the day you conducted your test, was it?
Now, in terms of the drag sled, I came back the following morning. The roadways were still wet, but in order to be sure that my results were accurate, I compared them to the
Objection, Your Honor. The witness is being non-responsive. I ask that you strike everything after yes.
Sustained.
Officer Foster, you didn't conduct a drag sled test on September 24th, 2010, did you?
No, I conducted on September 25th in the morning.
Now I want to talk more on September 24th, 2010. On that day, you were patrolling Canyon Road?
Yes, that was my assigned location, only for about an hour because I started at 11 p.m. So the majority of my shift was September 25th.
Officer Foster, on that day, you were looking to pull over any drivers driving unsafely.
Yes, as I do every day of my job.
Now you're an experienced patrol officer,
I've been doing this for approximately 10 years.
and you pull over cars every single day, as you just stated.
Not every day, but for the most part.
Relevance?
Now, maybe heard?
Oh, no, overruled.
You pull over drivers every day.
For the most part. Some days we get lucky and there aren't any.
You know what to look for when determining whether or not a driver needs to be off the road.
Yes, per my training experience, I look for certain signs of drivers that might need to be cited.
Alright, so at approximately 1 a.m., you saw a white Chevrolet Impala come down the road.
Are you referring to earlier when I'd seen it?
On September 25th, 2010, you saw a white Chevrolet Impala come down the road.
Yes, I did.
You now know that the driver of that car is Miss Dawson.
Yes, I do.
Now, when Miss Dawson came down the road, you didn't pull her over, did you?
No, at that point, I had gotten the radar gun reading, but I ended up leaving to another location, so I didn't.
So just to get this straight, on that day, you didn't pull Miss Dawson over, did you?
No, I did not.
You didn't pull her over for speeding?
No, I did not.
You didn't pull her over for reckless driving?
No, I did not.
You mentioned that you didn't pull over because you got called away to a scene, isn't that correct?
Yes, I got called away to another officer in need of assistance on Chambers Avenue.
But Officer Foster, isn't it true that if you thought Miss Dawson needed to be off the road, you would have taken care of this situation first before proceeding to helping the other officer?
Objection, Your Honor. Compound?
Overruled.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Officer Foster, if you thought that Miss Dawson needed to be off the road, you would have taken care of this situation first before helping the other officer. Isn't that correct?
It's within my discretion, and no, I didn't pull her over, so I guess that's correct.
So Officer Foster, just so the jury understands, you would have taken care of the situation with Ms. Dawson first. You would have pulled her over first before responding to the other scene if you thought she needed to be off the road.
In hindsight, I definitely would have pulled her over first.
Objection, Your Honor. Witness being non-responsive.
Sustained.
Move to strike everything after. Move to strike his answer.
Yes, it'll be stricken.
Officer Foster, directing me back to my question. If you thought that Ms. Dawson needed to be off the road on September 25th, 2010, you would have taken care of the situation first before proceeding to helping the other officer.
Sure,
Is that a yes?
sure, yes.
Now I want to talk about the field sobriety test you talked about in direct examination. You told us that you had Ms. Dawson walk heel to toe in a straight line.
That's correct.
And you mentioned on direct examination that when you had Ms. Dawson do this, she slipped.
I said she stepped out of line.
You said she almost fell down.
When she turned, yes.
But you would admit that on September 24th, 2010, it was a torrential downpour.
It had been earlier in the evening, yes.
It was raining.
Yes,
The road, it was still wet.
yes. At the time that we performed the test, it had stopped raining, but the roadway was still wet.
So when Ms. Dawson was performing the test, the roadway was still wet.
That's correct. And the driveway that we were on was a little slick as well.
In fact, when you were walking yourself, you almost slipped.
Yeah, when I came up from the vehicle, it was in the grass, and it's kind of an incline. When I walked up that grass, I slipped a little bit myself, to be fair.
And Officer Foster, you were perfectly sober that night, weren't you?
Yes, I wasn't drinking, I was at work.
I want to talk more about these field sobriety tests. Now, when you performed these field sobriety tests on Ms. Dawson, it wasn't just you and her at the scene, was it?
No, there were other people at the scene. We later took away Vanessa and Taylor with the EMTs. Another officer arrived at the location. The victim's mother arrived at the location. There were a variety of people there, as many accident scenes are like.
Officer Foster, it wasn't just you and Ms. Dawson at the scene, was it?
No, there were several other people in the scene.
In fact, one person you mentioned was Mrs. Sullivan.
Yes, the mother of the victim arrived.
So the mother's victim was on scene when you were performing your field sobriety test?
Unfortunately,
Objection, Your Honor, confusing. So the mother's victim was on the
I
scene?
think counsel
The victim's
misspoke.
mother.
yeah, unfortunately she found out about it and she was quite irate. And yes, she did show up at the scene and was trying to figure out what was going on with her daughter. I can't really blame her for that.
Officer Foster, she wasn't just trying to figure out what was going on with the daughter, was she?
Yes, I believe she was.
Well, she didn't just arrive on scene, she also screamed at Ms. Dawson, wasn't she?
Can you blame her? Her daughter just got killed.
Objection, our witness is being non-responsive again. Move to strike his answer.
Sustained.
Officer Foster, I'm going to ask you to answer my question. When Mrs. Sullivan arrived, she was screaming at Mrs. Dawson. Is that
She did
correct?
scream at Miss Dawson, yes.
And you were worried that her screaming might affect your test.
You know, I did ask her to stop. With irate manner, she kept going.
Officer Foster, I didn't ask you whether or not you asked her to stop. I asked you whether or not you were nervous that this might affect your test. And it
wasn't
did.
nervous, no.
So is it your testimony today here in court that you weren't worried that Vanessa Sullivan's mother screaming at Mrs. Dawson didn't make you nervous about your test?
Was I nervous? No, I wasn't nervous, no. I was
Officer Foster,
confident in
now
my
you,
being there. I wasn't nervous.
let me rephrase my question. You were nervous that Mrs. Sullivan screaming at Miss Dawson might affect the validity of your test.
My concern was that it might make Mr. Dawson nervous, or Miss Dawson nervous. I wasn't concerned about the validity of the test.
You were afraid that it might influence the results of your test. Isn't that correct?
No, I was concerned that possibly your client would be, her nerves would be a little shattered by it. You know, it's kind of tough staring at the mother of the victim.
So you're telling me here in court today that you weren't worried that your test might be affected if Miss Dawson was being screamed at by Mrs. Sullivan?
Well, the tests themselves have been done thousands of times, so I wasn't worried about the test itself. I was worried about Miss Dawson perhaps being a little nervous or affected by the mother being there.
Officer Foster, you're aware of the proper procedures in performing a field sobriety test?
Absolutely, I've been trained in them.
You would acknowledge that having the victim's mother scream at Mrs. Dawson isn't proper procedure.
There's no procedure about what the victim's mother would be saying at that particular moment. I've never seen a procedure to that.
So Officer Foster, you're telling us that in those conditions, they were ideal conditions for you to perform this test?
I believe that they were adequate conditions.
The victim's mother screaming at Mrs. Dawson were ideal conditions?
Objection, Your Honor, argumentative.
Overruled.
Well, she yelled at him at the start and she yelled at him at the end.
Objection, Your Honor. Witness is being non-responsive. Move to strike.
Sustained.
Officer Foster, I'm going to ask you one more time. Having the victim's mother scream at Mrs. Dawson, you're telling this court today that those are ideal conditions?
I didn't say it was ideal, I said they were adequate.
Thank you, Officer Foster. No further questions.
Thank you. Redirect.